In the 2nd and 3rd century, you begin to see some changes, however. Now, one of the things that we want to be focusing on here is we're talking about denominations. Where do denominations come from? And what I'm doing here, although a lot of the denominations that exist today are really very young in terms of Christianity, right, only a couple hundred years old, what I'm wanting us to see is that this push to divide has some very deep roots in Christian history. And that's important to see to kind of fully understand why we have denominationalism. And so, going the whole way back to the 1st century, saying even in the time of the apostles, you see people wanting to break off and go their own way. You see changes taking place. Some of those changes, are moving in directions of false doctrine, directions of heresy, we might say. These false teachings, unhealthy teachings. As we move into the 2nd and 3rd century, the post-apostolic period, we're moving now into a period where there is, the apostles have died. And so the people that are in this period, as we move into the 2nd, 3rd century, there are a few of them, particularly the 2nd century, who have interacted with apostles. But as we go through, of course, we're moving further and further from that time period. Right? And so the only interaction that these people have is in the stories that are handed down and the writings that are handed down. But very early on, we begin to see even greater changes that are taking place. One particular important leadership development that takes place in the apostolic period is the shift from a plurality of leaders over a specific congregation to what we might call a monarchical bishop. Now, what does that mean? Essentially the idea that there is one man, right, a single leader, who is head of a particular church. Right? So a monarch, like reflected like a king, not that these bishops were kings, but this idea of the singularity of leadership. And the term bishop comes from the term overseer, right? So the idea is still oversight, but that there's one man that does this. Now, it's unclear how this takes place. We simply know that it does, and fairly early on in the 2nd century, there's indication that there are several churches that have moved to this model. It could have been something very, what we might call innocent, in the sense of, you have a group of leaders, let's say, and the oldest of those leaders is given a lot of respect because he's older, and so respecting seniority, etc. And in a generation or so, that it's kind of morphed into this model of that there's this one leader, and then below them are additional leaders. Whether that happened or not, it's not clear, but we could see how that could happen. There are a variety of functions that these leaders took on, including appointing other leaders. And so perhaps as well, in the appointment of leaders, one particular individual was given some more preference or honor in doing that, right? We'll respect you to take care of that. Perhaps that's what took place, and then over time that eventually becomes this one individual. We're not exactly sure, but eventually it shifts from a group of people overseeing to one particular person overseeing. However, even in this singular type of leadership model, each congregation appears to be autonomous. There isn't a grouping of churches under one particular individual. each congregation or each assembly of believers is separate from each other. Now, there is communication between these churches. We have several of those letters. People trying to encourage or persuade churches that they're not a part of, that they're not the leader over. You need to make some changes. But largely, there isn't any sort of leadership model present in second and third Christianity, second and third century Christianity, that allows for the the force of, well, you have to believe this or you have to practice this way. Essentially, what we're talking about is that there is no hierarchy, right? And so congregations are kind of left on their own, in a sense, as to how they are going to interpret and follow Scripture. Now, again, not denominational, right? Each of these are churches, but localized churches. But there is this opportunity for congregations to go in a variety of different directions, because there isn't that kind of hierarchy that's going to ensure everyone stays in line. In the second and third century as well, you see this continuance of important differences taking place. However, what we see is a greater a greater distinction taking place regionally. As we look at the Roman Empire in this first, second, third, fourth century period, and thinking about Christianity, which is spread throughout the Roman Empire by the end of the first century, gradually there are distinctions that are taking place between the western part of the Roman Empire and the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Now, there's a lot of similarity, of course, a lot of unity on a variety of issues and ideas and practices, but you also begin to see some cultural changes taking place. The western part of the Roman Empire is largely shaped by Latin culture. Right? Latin's the language that's predominantly used. There are other aspects of Latin culture that are shaping Christianity in the West. In the East, it's more influenced by Greek culture. So Greek language is very important. A lot of Greek customs taking place in the eastern part. And so you have some cultural differences divided. But there are also some differences in ritual that are developing, differences in belief that are developing. For example, while Christians every first day of the week celebrated the resurrection of Jesus, at some point there was the decision to really remember the day of his resurrection, the specific day in the year, and an annual observance. So, again, every week, there's the observance of the resurrection, but the decision to kind of specifically that day. The question, though, becomes, what day do you use? Now, Christians, of course, would have connected it with Passover, the Jewish celebration of Passover, because Jesus was crucified at Passover. But because the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar, the observance of Passover moves. Right? So Jesus, of course, observes Passover on Thursday. He's crucified on Friday. He rises from the dead on Sunday, that particular year. But Passover is not always on a Thursday. It might be on a Monday. So those in the East thought that this annual celebration, there were some in the East that thought this annual celebration should be based on whenever Passover was. Right? So whatever day of the week Passover was, then the next day would be the day that Jesus was crucified, and then the day that he was entombed. Then the next day should be the annual observance of his resurrection from the dead. In the West, however, it was felt that no matter what day of the week Passover fell, the annual observance should always be on a Sunday, because Jesus rose on the first day of the week. So no matter what day Passover falls, you should observe it on the first day of the week. So you have some of those differences that take place as well. And, you have some important distinctions that are taking place between East and West. They're kind of going in some slightly different directions, because as they begin talking about and trying to understand different things about Jesus and Christianity, they are putting it into Greek terms, or they're putting it into Latin terms. And sometimes the baggage that those Latin and Greek terms carry is slightly different, so that there's not clear communication between East and West about what each other is talking about. And so there's some disagreements that take place because, well, you're saying such and such, but we're actually saying something different. So you have some division there. That is certainly kind of like the difference between Paul and James, but on a grander scale, and actually moving in some places into some very important distinctions, where we might say, between Paul and James, well, we can get along and we can agree and we can still consider each other as Christians and fellowship. But in the East and West, however, some of these distinctions are causing Western Christians or Eastern Christians to question some of the things that are going on in the other region of the Roman Empire. In addition to those differences that are developing between Christians, there are some major issues developing in the first and second centuries, in the second and third centuries, that we would term heresy. These things are absolute false teachings. And so you have some people who, again, there's a core there that's kind of Christian, but what's been added to it is not Christian. So you have, some of these individuals and teachers and leaders in the second, third century going in these directions that are completely heretical, that are separate and apart from what the teaching of Jesus truly was, and they are leading others as well. People who think that they are that what is being expressed is true. One example of the heresy during this time is Marcionism. Marcionism is named after a man named Marcion, who was a Christian in the middle of the second century. Grew up in a Christian home. His father was a Christian bishop, but Marcion was very against Judaism. And so he wanted to see all the Jewish elements out of Christianity, removed out of Christianity. Which, of course, Christianity develops within Judaism. The early followers of Jesus were Jews. Jesus himself, ethnically, was a Jew. And in many respects, the things done and believed in Christianity were the fulfillment of, or the spiritualizing of, Jewish things that God had ordained. So, this is an impossibility, but Marcion wants to do it. He believes, he's got such a hatred for the Jews. He even goes so far to claim that there were actually two gods, and that the Old Testament God was a different being from the New Testament God, or what he called the Father of Jesus. The Old Testament God was a vindictive being, looking to punish people, was not truly a supreme being in his mind. The Old Testament God loved only Israel. But the God of Jesus was a universal God, loved everyone, but probably not the Jews, certainly the way Marcion is. And so he has this idea that there's essentially these two gods, which although Christians talk about Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, we emphasize, of course, that there's just one God. But here's Marcion saying, no, there's two gods. And we're not even talking about a distinction between Father and Son. We're talking about a distinction between the Old Testament God and the Father of Jesus. Marcion was also important because he created the first recorded canon. Now, a canon, in this sense, with just the two ends instead of three, is a list of authoritative books, a list of scriptures. And Marcion appears to be the first person who has actually set down what the authoritative books, what are the true Christian scriptures. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, that Christians weren't considering scriptures. They had the Old Testament, of course, and now the letters of Paul and those kind of things. But Marcion appears to be the first one to write down a list of, these are the books, which for him was the Gospel of Luke, which was heavily edited, and 10 of the letters of Paul. So there was something, of course, Paul was a Jew, and a lot of the things that Paul said related to, kind of its continuity of Judaism. But Marcion here is the first person to kind of set out and say, these are the authoritative books. And his movement lasts for quite a while, over a century, of people following after some of his teachings.